over time, let's fund this nonprofit, not that. I know of nonprofits, people leak me things all the time from within their nonprofits. I got a leak that said, we were told once you get this check from this one of the big 5 funders in the tech world, you have to stop using the word inequality and remove it from your website and documents. This group fights inequality. That's what the nonprofit does. You have to call it poverty from now on. Why? Because poverty is just about your situation. Inequality is a relationship. It's about what I'm doing and what you're doing. It's about our gap.
The whole reason that Insight published The Revolution Will Not Be Funded in 2004 was because of the following experience they had. In 2004, Insight received an email from the Ford Foundation with the subject line, "Congratulations," and an offer of a 1-year or 2-year grant of $100,000 to cover our general operating expenses in response to a grant proposal Ford Foundation had solicited from us. We committed to 2 major projects based on this funding. Then, unexpectedly, on July 30th, 2004, the Ford Foundation sent another letter explaining that it had reversed its decision because of our organization's statement of support for the Palestinian liberation struggle. Insight realized from this experience that there are some serious consequences for social movements when they rely on foundation funding. In this case, they lost a $100,000 grant due to a political position they stated on their website. And just to think about this for a minute, let's say that $100,000 was going to pay for 2 full-time organizing positions, 2 full-time jobs for 2 women of color working on radically transforming society in a positive direction. I hear people say all the time they'd do more activism if they actually got paid for it, because when you have a normal full-time job and you try to do activism on the side, you can easily get burnt out and give up altogether. So consider that losing a $100,000 grant can mean literally losing your job as an activist. We live in an actual economy, not some abstract world of ideas. And so if foundation funding has the power to give you a job or take that very job away, and if you're passionate about something, you're likely to do whatever the foundation funders tell you to say or tell you to not say, so that you can have that job of your dreams, so that you can make change. As I mentioned briefly in Part 5, Erica Colarinas covers this general trend of how funders can really shape the direction of a social movement in her research on the migrant farm worker movements of the 1960s and beyond. One of her case studies is on Cesar Chavez, who fought to organize farm workers in California and Florida. He and Dolores Huerta eventually co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, which employed traditional labor-focused tactics such as boycotts and strikes to help farm workers get their needs and their demands met. The movement for farm worker rights became more militant through the 1960s with both successes and failures, but the emphasis was largely rooted in a radical vision assuming that workers should have the most say when it comes to the work they do, the land they work on, and anything related to the distribution of the profits which their labor produces. Such radicalism of vision and militancy of tactics made foundation funders increasingly uncomfortable. So by 1970, after Chavez and others decided to form a 501c3 nonprofit called the National Farm Worker Service Center, tons of funding began to pour in. Why? Because the service center focused on things like getting housing for farm worker families, education for their children, and healthcare services. Over time, the radicalism and militancy of the movement died down, and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta became celebrated as historic figures who led radical movements at one point, but they actually became nonprofit managers whose priorities shifted toward making sure farm workers and their families had access to foundation-funded services. It's hard to say if the movement would have resulted in the collective ownership of all the land farmed by migrant farm workers, and if all those farms would have eventually be run within some utopian federation of worker cooperatives or something. But one thing is for sure, when your movement's most militant and inspiring leaders give up on radical demands because they won't be funded and shift towards shuffling paperwork around in order to tend to nonprofit managerial duties, there just is no way for such a radical vision to become realized. In 2019, researcher Megan Ming Francis coined the term movement capture to describe this exact phenomenon. Foundations and philanthropists using funding as a means to superficially embrace social movements, giving activists and their organizations more money and full-time activist jobs to then redirect and shape those very movements into whatever form those funders would prefer to see. Francis doesn't imply necessarily that funders do this as a deliberate way to shape movements, although in many cases this probably has happened. She simply points out how funders are uncomfortable with a seemingly too radical approach within a movement, and so they won't fund that approach, but they will fund whatever seems not too radical, which then shapes the entire direction of that movement from that point forward. Francis's research is mainly related to civil rights activism driven by the NAACP in the early 1900s. Drawing on economic theories of regulatory and state capture, I use capture as a way to understand how private funders operate like interest groups or private firms to buy influence over the goals and strategies of activists and cause lawyers. In this article, I propose the concept of movement capture, the process by which private funders leverage their financial resources to apply pressure and influence the decision-making process of civil rights organizations. The movement capture framework hinges on the power imbalance between those that have resources and those that need them. In this way, movement capture relates to the work that highlights the power asymmetries embedded in the relationship between community organizations, international and domestic, and funding from NGOs and businesses who take a corporate social responsibility approach to governance. The institutional environment matters, and funders are most likely to maximize their influence over civil rights organizations during the early stages of organizational development when funders are scarce or during a period of considerable financial instability. According to this framework, funders are self-interested actors that can exploit their elevated financial position by linking provision of funds to the pursuit of new goals or by shifting the salience of existing agenda issues. Francis traces the history and shift of priorities within the NAACP as follows. The NAACP was formed in 1909, and its number one priority was to stop lynching because it was a widespread issue throughout the South and elsewhere. It was straight-up terrorism and, Black Lives Matter. Like most small organizations, at some point, the NAACP realized they needed money to sustain their movement, but the only major funding available to them was from people who thought that while violence against black people was definitely bad, that getting black people access to the same education that white people had was a better strategic direction for the movement. Funding thereby eventually shifted the NAACP's focus away from anti-lynching and toward desegregation, which led to the now historic and well-known Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1964, which ended racial segregation within schools, at least on paper. This is popularly regarded as a movement success, but Francis argues that there was a price the NAACP ended up having to pay in the long term, as a consequence of their shift from anti-violence and toward education. The focus on education sidelined concerns of criminal procedure, siphoned resources away from the campaign around workers' economic rights, and undermined the concerns of black labor. Erica Cole Arenas discovered that with the farm worker movement of the 1960s and beyond, funders would help pay for education and social services, but not union efforts, worker-owned cooperatives, or pathways toward collective ownership of the land that farm workers were farming. Francis discovered that, similarly, funders wouldn't fund anti-lynching or black-led labor efforts. Funders in both cases, however, were eager to fund anything that shifted focus toward social services. What has happened to the great civil rights and black power movements of the 1960s and 70s? Where are the mass movements of today within this country? The short answer, they got funded. Join us next time for Part 7, Professionalism.
Sam, Carly Berman, Zach, Isabel Abdullali, Kelgar Trout, Nicholas Mastello, Katie Drax, Davey MK, Diane Prado, Lauren, Garbage Opossum, Space Commune, Ashley Altman, Pablo Ruiz, Ulrich Volker Anderson, Jamie Smith, Dylan Yee, Labor Kyle, Fiona, Chaotic Capybara, The Appalachian Left, Dirt Knight, L, Halim Al-Ra, Wes, Leo Samalati, Bryden Beck, Laura Dale, Noah, Esmail Fadeh, Ace, Super Arjuna Butt, Sebastian Nitu, Waltzing Kia.
Cal Swagger, he's so smart. He's a sweet boy, sweet like a pop tart. He writes books, he makes streams. He got Python up in his dreams. Said ow, 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 ow.